what I focus on, frankly, is based on a very elementary moral principle. I realize it's almost universally rejected, but I'd still like to reiterate it. Our prime concern should be our own responsibilities. Our prime concern for anybody should be the predictable consequences of your own actions. I mean, it's very it's very convenient and you know, to be self-righteous and to talk about somebody else's crimes. So you know, if you were a Russian commissar in the 1970s, it would be very convenient to concentrate on U.S. crimes. But the important thing to do in Russia was not that. I don't care whether Sakharov said anything about U.S. crimes. What you care is what they're saying about their own society and something they can do about. And the same elementary moral principle applies to us. The focus of our attention should be on what we can do, what we are doing, what are the options for us to try to terminate major crimes in which we're involved, and there are plenty of them, and to mitigate harm and atrocities elsewhere. And there's a lot that we can do.
Well, we have to be careful about the term American exceptionalism. And for one thing, it's not at all exceptional. Every imperial power has behaved the same way, sometimes worse. So it's just normal imperial practice. It's called exceptionalism, but nothing about that. Of course, it's supposed to be exceptional in that we have the highest ideals. So maybe we make mistakes, but it's always with the highest ideals. That's American exceptionalism. Except that, too, is true of just about every imperial power. So when the British were destroying the world, they were always doing it with the absolutely highest ideals. The leading figures, leading intellectuals, people like John Stuart Mill, estimable people, were describing England as an angelic country beyond anything that anyone's ever imagined. People can't understand how marvelous we are, and so on. The French were the same. It's hard to find an exception.
You've said that the course of history may be determined to a very significant degree by what the people of the United States will have learned from the catastrophe, meaning, of course, the Vietnam War. What, in your opinion, have we learned from this experience?
I would say very little, unfortunately. At the time I wrote that, which I guess was 7 or 8 years ago, what I had in mind was that there are really two different ways of looking at this catastrophe. One can look at it as a failed venture, a mistake, something which was...
It was a mistake because it failed.
Mistake because it failed, but perfectly all right if it succeeded. And I think it's probably fair to say that at least among intellectuals, people who write and speak publicly...
You've been rather harsh on the intellectuals.
Yeah, I think they're totally unprincipled on this. I mean, I think the dominant view is that if we had gotten away with it, it would have been all right, but we couldn't get away with it, so therefore it was stupid, and therefore we should get out. You know, worse than a crime, it was a blunder or something of that sort. Now, if that's all that's learned from it, I think it'll have no effect on future history. It will have shown that there are limits to American imperialism.
And your opposition has been on moral grounds, that it was wrong from the outset, although you said your opposition came 15 years too late.
Well, active opposition came 15 years too late. I think the time for active opposition should have been about 1950 or a little later. But I didn't become really actively engaged in opposing the war until about 1964, 65. And at that point, the United States was very deeply involved in what, if we were honest, we would call aggression against South Vietnam. That's in fact what it was. But I had, of course, always been opposed to the war.
The Vietnam War actually began for the United States in 1950. And from 1954 to 1960, the U.S. had a kind of a Latin American-style terror regime in place. And it wasn't any joke. They killed about 60 or 70,000 people, but there was no protest. I mean, zero. When Kennedy took over, they escalated it to, pretty soon it became a direct U.S. attack. Still no protest. I mean, through the early 60s, you couldn't get anybody to sign a petition. I mean, nobody would come to a meeting. I remember we used to try to organize meetings on Vietnam. Some of the few people, couple of students, a few others who were interested, but we'd have to put together half a dozen topics. I mean, Iran, Venezuela, you know, Vietnam, 6 other top, and then maybe you could get more people than organizers. By 1965 or 1966, it was becoming a big issue. But protests were met with extreme hostility. I mean, take Boston right here. And this is a pretty liberal city. But we couldn't have public protests against the war. They'd be violently broken up. The speakers would be saved from being murdered only by hundreds of state police. And it would be praised, the protests would be, the attack on the protesters would be praised in the liberal media. I remember my wife, I had 2 little girls. My wife and the 2 kids went to a women's protest. It was, you know what it's like. I mean, they're not throwing stones, just people walking around with children. And this was in Concord. It's a suburb, quiet, professional, upper middle class suburb. I mean, they were attacked. People throwing tin cans and tomatoes and so on, and that was considered right. You know, it wasn't until late 1966 that there was enough of a change so you really had substantial public opposition. I mean, that's 5 years after the war was started. By then, there were hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging around South Vietnam, and the war, of course, extended to the rest of Indochina. And nobody knows how many people were killed because nobody counted. So, I mean, another interesting thing about the Vietnam War is we have no idea what the costs were to the Vietnamese. I mean, for the United States, we know down to the last person. And the big post-war issue is finding the bones of American pilots. But nobody has any idea how many Vietnamese died.
You asked us after September 11, one of your points is we ought to look in the mirror, we being America or the West. We ought to look in the mirror at our own. Was that a way of saying, look, people like bin Laden are angry at us for good reason?
No,
in other words, is there a way to justify...
That's not what I was saying. The statement of mine that you just quoted is a very conservative statement. In fact, it was articulated by George Bush's favorite philosopher, Jesus Christ, who pointed out, famously defined the notion hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who focuses on the other fellow's crimes and refuses to look at his own. That's the definition of hypocrite by George Bush's favorite philosopher. When I repeat that, I'm not taking a radical position. I'm taking a position which is just elementary morality.
I don't want to get Gnostic here and religious on it, but I do want to...
This is not religion. This is elementary morality. If people cannot rise to the level of applying to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, they have no right to talk about right and wrong or good and evil.
But let's talk about even in right. And look, there's nobody pure, but an argument has been made. I know that the U.S. has committed atrocities. However, they did oust a more brutal regime, the Taliban. There wasn't even a war aim. There wasn't even a war aim. Wasn't even a war aim. But is that a moral thing to do? They did get rid of a brutal regime. There was celebration in Canada.
Good, fine. Let them bomb Israel and get rid of the brutal regime there. Let them bomb Uzbekistan and get rid of the brutal regime there.
You say the Taliban and the Israeli government are the same?
No, they're not the same. They're brutal regimes. But let's go back a stage. The goal was not to oust the Taliban. That was not a war aim. That was a war aim that was picked up several weeks after the bombing started. Okay? And let's go back. Suppose that and there are dozens of, long list of brutal regimes around the world, which ought to be overthrown, but not by somebody bombing them. However, let's go back to the late October, when after 3 weeks of bombing, when the U.S. and its British client decided to shift the war aims to overthrowing the Taliban regime. There was a meeting sponsored by the United States in Peshawar, Pakistan, of 1,000 Afghan leaders. They unanimously condemned the bombing and said it was undermining their efforts, which they thought could succeed, to overthrow the Taliban regime from within. The U.S. is doing it just to show off their muscle.
All right, now
so the question of whether to overthrow a regime, that arises. And I think the Afghans are right. Regimes should be overthrown from within, and in this case, it was probably very likely that that would succeed. It was a small, brutal group highly unpopular, plenty of opposition to it, which could have been organized from within, and that's the way to overthrow a regime. If we want to overthrow the regime of Uzbekistan, now a great favorite, but it happens to be not very different from the Taliban, the way to do it would not be to bomb Uzbekistan, but to support internal democratic forces and let them do it. And that generalizes around the world.
Now, Robert Kaplan, who writes about foreign policy, I spoke to him recently about his book, Warrior Politics, and I put some of your points to him. He said about the distinction between the terrorist states that you call Israel, America, and the terrorist states that America calls the Taliban. He said, I wish Noam Chomsky had been with me in Romania in the 70s or the 80s, just one of the 7 or 8 Warsaw states with just one of the 7 or 8 prison systems with 700,000 political prisoners. Adult choice of foreign policy is made on distinctions. The argument that Chomsky makes has no distinctions because there's a difference between the quantity and the kind of dictators that America supported and the quantity and the kind of things we went in communist world for 44 years.
Okay, so let's take his example, Romania, Ceausescu, hideous regime, which he forgot to tell you the United States supported. Supported right till the end, as did Britain. So the example that he gave is a perfect example, and it's a small example, because we support much more brutal regimes. Suharto was one of the worst killers and torturers of the late 20th century. The United States and Britain supported him throughout. He's our kind of guy, as the Clinton administration said in 1995. Horrible atrocities. In fact, when he came into office in 1965 with a coup, the CIA compared it to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. It led to total euphoria in the United States and Britain, massive support when he carried out even worse atrocities, comparable atrocities elsewhere. The couple of, hundreds of thousands of people killed then, hundreds of thousands later. Full support, continued right through the end of his rule. In fact, continued past his rule. In late 1999, when they were rampaging and destroying what was left of East Timor, the U.S. and Britain continued to support him. And I can continue through the world like this.
Well, Kaplan says that there is a distinction. Everyone's got some blood on their hands, but he says, we have significantly less blood because what we are is a soft imperialist, not state terrorist.
So like when we supported his example, Ceausescu in Romania right to the end, that's good. How about killing several million people in Vietnam? How about killing hundreds of thousands of people in Central America in the 80s, leaving 4 countries devastated beyond, maybe beyond recovery?
Qualify the U.S. from their intervening in any other way?
Look, nor does it disqualify the fact that bin Laden is a terrorist, or that, say, the Taliban are a terrorist state, that fact doesn't disqualify them from bombing Washington. What disqualifies from doing that is even if they were Mahatma Gandhi, they shouldn't do it. Kaplans can't understand trivialities. The triviality here is that nobody except the ultra-right-wing jingoists like Kaplan is comparing atrocities by various countries. What honest people are saying, this seems to be incomprehensible, is that we should keep to the elementary moral level of the Gospels. We should pay attention to our own crimes and stop committing them. This would be true even if we were killing one person, okay? And it's even more true when we're killing millions of people.
Let's bring it to the bigger picture than just because the question, he says, we all agree with the Gospels. This is, and then
he doesn't. He doesn't.
But he says, look,
does.
I believe in a Hobbesian world. This is what he says.
So is he saying we should overthrow
it's nasty. If you leave people alone, they'll kill each other.
Yeah.
And that's why what you need, was he calls, is an organizing hegemon, an overweening power.
Which is always us.
Yeah, which is always us, he says.
Right, because and why is it us? Because we have the power. And we have a massively subservient intellectual class, of which he's an illustration, which will support U.S. atrocities no matter how awful they are.
But he says this is real politics. That Chomsky's off in another land with his gospel, that he says,
forget gospel. I'm talking about the most elementary morality. If a person doesn't understand that, they have no right to talk. okay? If you don't understand that you pay attention to your own crimes, you have no right to talk.
He talks about Machiavellian virtue. Sometimes we do a bad thing to protect our democratic and our good institutions and a just society.
Yes. Now, how are we protecting our democratic institutions by supporting mass slaughter in southeastern Turkey in the last few years? Was that supporting our democratic institutions?
Was it supporting
our democratic institutions?
Not ours, but
anybody?
Would Kaplan argue that the nation state has a right to use any means necessary to protect its sovereignty?
Oh, then he's justifying Milosevic. He's saying Milosevic had the right to do anything he wanted to repress the Kosovars in Albania. Is that what he's saying?
Do we need a constabulary, a force, a central force? In this case, it's America because it's the superpower, to sometimes use unjust means in the service of just causes.
What are the just causes? What was the just cause in, for example, slaughtering Kurds in southeastern Turkey? What was the just cause? What was the just cause in supporting Suharto when he killed a couple 100,000 landless peasants in Indonesia, went on to become one of the biggest torturers in the world, and then slaughtered a third of the population of East Timor? What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we invaded South Vietnam 40 years ago? This is the 40th anniversary of the public announcement of the U.S. attack on South Vietnam, ending up killing millions of people, leaving the country devastated. They're still dying from chemical warfare. What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we fought a war to a large extent against the Catholic Church in Central America in the 1980s, killing hundreds of thousands of people, every imaginable kind of torture and devastation? What was the just cause? Can I continue? Yeah, the just cause for people like Kaplan is we did it. Therefore, it's a just cause. You can read that in the Nazi archives, too. Everyone has to line up and sing hosannas to our leaders. That's the job of intellectuals. Round up the chorus so they all sing praises to your leaders while they march in the parade and tell you how magnificent we are. I mean, that's the historic task of intellectuals, not just here. I mean, it's a historic task. I mean, let's go back, say, to World War I, far enough away so we can think about it. What did intellectuals do during World War I? Well, first thing that happened is 93 leading German intellectuals published a manifesto calling on their colleagues in the rest of the world to support Germany in its magnificent aim to bring justice and peace to the world. What did the American intellectuals do? Exactly the same thing. In fact, they all lauded the magnificence of their own leaders. There were some exceptions. Most of them ended up in jail on both sides. So in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht objected and were in jail. In England, Bertrand Russell objected. He was in jail. In the United States, Eugene Debs is the leading figure in U.S. labor in the 20th century and a socialist presidential candidate. He went to jail for raising mild questions about Woodrow Wilson's war. And others were just repressed, like Randolph Bourne was kicked out of all of his journals and so on, because they didn't join the parade, and intellectuals are supposed to join the parade, and they do. Exceptions are so rare, you can practically list them. I mean, there are exceptions, and there are honorable ones. Actually, most of them are in the third world. I'll give you quite a few. But in the West, most intellectuals are very loyal and submissive. Why is there hatred against us there? George Bush's famous question. Well, everyone knows the answer to this. A couple of days after I have to distinguish two things here. There's a category of people called intellectuals. Their task is to make up fabrications that protect power and divert attention from what's obvious and indoctrinate people and so on. And they've concocted all sorts of complicated stories about globalization and, failure to enter the modern world and this, that, and the other thing. Okay, and they envy us because we're so wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. All right, we can put all that aside. That's standard propaganda. Let's talk about what is plainly the case and is in fact discussed by serious people, like, say, the Wall Street Journal. So a few days after the September 11th, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, began running serious stories in which they investigated opinions of people in the Islamic world who they're interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, the ones with, the rich ones, the important ones. So bankers, international lawyers, directors of multinational corporations, people who are right inside the U.S. system who certainly have no opposition to what's called globalization. In fact, they're part of it, who certainly hate bin Laden because he's trying to kill them, but who nevertheless agree with much of what he says. And what they say is, their opinions are that the United States supports brutal and corrupt regimes which block democracy and modernization and development. They oppose particular policies like the decisive U.S. support for the 35-year military occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been harsh and brutal and relies crucially on U.S. military and diplomatic support. When you read in the newspapers that Israeli helicopters and jets are attacking Palestinians, that's total fabrication. U.S. jets and U.S. helicopters, which happen to be piloted by Israeli pilots, are attacking those concentrations. That's what ought to be said. Israel doesn't manufacture helicopters or F-16s, and they understand all that. They know that the U.S. has been blocking any diplomatic settlement for 30 years, since Sadat offered one in 1971. It's not reported here, and in the West it's not talked about much, but they know it. And they know what's going on there. They also know perfectly well that the U.S. and Britain are carrying out operations against Iraq, which are devastating the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they also remember, as Westerners like to forget, that the U.S. has no, and Britain and France and Holland and so on, have no objection to Saddam Hussein's crimes. We know that for sure, because they supported Saddam Hussein right through the period of his worst crimes. Gassing the Kurds, Anfal, chemical weapons. They continued to support him very happily. He remained a good, favored friend and ally of the West, which helped provide him with the means for developing weapons of mass destruction when he was really dangerous. So they listened when Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright condemned Saddam because, the ultimate monster even gassed his own people. They listened, but they add the words that are excluded in the West. They say, yeah, he committed those crimes with your support. Okay, rather crucial omission, which you never hear from Tony Blair and the rest. But they are not that indoctrinated, so they remember those elementary truths. And those are other reasons why, if you want, there's hatred against us. Furthermore, there's absolutely nothing new about this. Anybody who wants to understand any of it knows exactly where to go. You go to the declassified U.S. record. U.S. is a very open society. We have declassified records of internal deliberations from the past. All these questions came up decades ago. So and had the same answers. In 1958, crucial year for many reasons. I'm now talking about internal records. The U.S., so the Eisenhower administration, discussed three major crises for the United States. One was Indonesia. One was North Africa. Third was the Middle East. All Islamic countries, all oil producers. The question arose whether the Russians were involved. That was dismissed as ludicrous, no Russian involvement. It's just independent nationalism in the three countries, which was the main crisis. Then Eisenhower pointed out, with regard to the Middle East, in his words approximately, he said there is a campaign of hatred against us, not by the governments, but by the people. And that was an issue that was discussed. No globalization, no, they hate us because we have McDonald's and none of this stuff. Why is there a campaign of hatred against us? Well, the National Security Council discussed it. That's the highest analysis and planning body. And they said the problem is that there's a perception among the people of the region that the United States supports corrupt and harsh regimes which prevent democratization and development, and does so because of its interest in controlling Near East oil. And they said it's hard to counter this perception because it's true. And furthermore, it should be true. because we should support those regimes in order to maintain our control over Near East oil. So therefore, there is a campaign of hatred against us by the people who see that we're robbing their resources and preventing democracy and development. But, we can't do much about it because that's what we ought to be doing. Well, like I say, no McDonald's, no envying us our magnificence, no globalization, just perfectly obvious things. The same reason why there was a campaign of hatred against England from the people of India, or against Holland from the people of the East Indies, and so on and so forth. Yeah, you crush people under your boot, they don't like it. So there's a campaign of hatred against you. In fact, what they were discussing internally in 1958 is the same as what the Wall Street Journal found in 2001, and for the same reasons, because the policies haven't fundamentally changed. So we understand. The Wall Street Journal only was concerned with elite opinion. If they'd gone down to the slums of Cairo, they would have gotten stronger opinions, but of the same kind, and more different ones also. Because in the slums of Cairo, they wouldn't like the fact that the wealth of the region is going to the West and not to the people of the region. The ones who the Wall Street Journal was talking about are quite happy about that, because they're part of the ruling elite and they enrich themselves while the resources go to the West. So they're part of the imperial system. So you get different opinions if you bother to ask people in the so-called streets. But fundamentally, it's the same. So there's a campaign. So Bin Laden's messages certainly resonate, and people agree with a lot of the things he's saying. About 80% of Egyptians, for example, say that the most important issue to them is the crushing of the Palestinians. So when they hear Bin Laden say it, they agree. There's nothing to do with whether they like him or hate him. On the other hand, there is a clique of radical Islamists who were organized and trained and brought together by Western intelligence for their own purposes, and have continued to do for 20 years just what they've always said they were going to do. So while some things are obscure, I don't think these are obscure. I think the answers are quite transparent.
What state does function according to what you call the minimal levels of honesty? Is there a state?
None. States are power centers. The only thing that imposes constraints on them is either outside force or their own populations. So the United States...
Internal criticism,
yes,
critical dialogue.
That's exactly why the intellectuals who we're talking about are so adamant at preventing people in the United States and Britain from learning the most elementary facts about themselves.
But is it even possible then? If you say no state functions,
it's not only possible, it happens. The United States, for example, is far more civilized than it was 40 years ago. Let's just take that. This March happened to be the 40th anniversary of the public announcement by the Kennedy administration that the U.S. Air Force is bombing South Vietnam. It also initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops, initiated napalm, started driving millions of people into concentration camps to separate them from the guerrillas who they knew they were supporting. This was all public. Did we commemorate the 40th anniversary? No. Why? Because 40 years ago, nobody cared. If the government announces, okay, we're going to start bombing another country and use chemical warfare to wipe out their crops and drive them to concentration camps, fine, not a problem. So there was no protest and no discussion.
But now there's more protest and
yes,
discussion.
because the country has gotten more civilized. No U.S. president today, or for the last 20 years, could conceivably do what Kennedy could do with total impunity 40 years ago. And the reason is because there was massive popular protest opposed by the intellectual classes, of course, who hate it. But it led to all sorts of things, including opposition to aggression and violence. It also spawned the contemporary civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movements, and all sorts of other things. And it imposed important constraints on straight violence. In fact, that's how we got rid of slavery. That's how we got rid of feudalism. That's how every step of...
So are we moving towards an emancipation from these things?
Slowly.
You're optimistic?
Yes. Over time, there has been agonizingly slow progress, but very real, always opposed by the intellectuals who support violence and atrocities and try to justify them and try to prevent the population from knowing about them. But fortunately, their control is limited, and therefore
what will the state look like at the end?
At the end?
Yeah.
The end is a long time.
Okay,
but
but
my
I mean,
own view is,
what would we look like?
at the end, I think states ought to dissolve because I think they're illegitimate structures. But that's a long time.
That's
end.
it.
But
But it is the end of the nation state that you foresee in the vision.
I don't foresee anything. What I'm saying is that as long as people, ordinary people, are able to free themselves from the doctrinal controls imposed on them by their self-appointed betters and mentors, as long as they're able to do this, they'll continue to be able to struggle for peace and justice and freedom and limitations on violence and constraints on power, as they've been doing for hundreds of years, and I don't see any end to that. Where it'll end up in the long run, I can tell you where I'd like it to, but I wouldn't even dream about that. The immediate problem is to free ourselves from the shackles imposed very consciously by the kind of people you're talking about, who don't want the facts to be known, and for very good reasons, because if people know the facts, they're not going to tolerate them. So therefore you have to prevent them from knowing. You have to indoctrinate them. You have to tell them stories about how we're really good guys, and if we use violence, it must be for the general good because we represent the course of history. Yeah, that's the job of propagandists for power and violence. And it's the task of populations to free themselves from those kinds of controls and domination.
In your view, what's wrong with private ownership of the means of production?
We should not have relations of hierarchy, dominance, subordination, centralized control over the means of life, people who give orders.
Private ownership applies all that?
Yeah.
How?
I mean, if you have private ownership of the means of production, it means that, first of all, the people, it's not just one person, it's a institution, so you get like, maybe it's a corporation or private business or something. First of all, internally, it's essentially a totalitarian institution, almost necessarily. There's a group at the top, maybe a person or a group, they make the decisions, they give orders, people down the hierarchy get the orders, transmit them. At the very bottom, you get people who are permitted to rent themselves to survive. That's called a job, wage labor. And you get the outside community who's allowed to purchase what you produce, and of course they're very heavily propagandized to make them want to consume it even if they don't. So I mean, that's the nature of the system. It's kind of about as close to totalitarianism as you can imagine. Private enterprise works just the way Milton Friedman says. You give the worst possible service at the highest possible profit. That's what it means to be in the business. If you try to be benevolent, you're out of the business because somebody undercuts you. So the nature of the system, as insight goes way back to Adam Smith, is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit and market share and give the worst possible service. Same with HMOs and everything else. The system has unacceptable risk built into it. It's well known among economists that markets are inefficient from the narrowest perspective. So to make it simple, suppose you and I, suppose you sell me a car, okay? We may make a good deal for ourselves. We're not taking into account the effect on him. It's what's called an externality. And there's an effect. If you sell me a car, it increases gas prices, increases pollution, increases congestion, and that extends very broadly. These so-called externalities can be very large. Now, in financial institutions, it's far worse. They're in the business of taking risks. If they're well managed, they calculate the potential cost to themselves if there's a loss. But the important words are to themselves. They don't calculate in what's called systemic risk, the effect on the whole system if I make, if I go bust, and has a huge effect. The result is that risk-taking is underpriced, meaning there's a lot more of it than there would be in a reasonable system.
In your role as CEO of a corporation, you are compelled to maximize profit and to ignore what economists call externalities, that is, the impact of your transactions on others. Well, That's why we have repeated financial crises ever since Reagan and Thatcher. The deregulation of the financial institutions means that the people who run them have to ignore what's called systemic risk, the risk that a transaction is going to bring down the system. And since you ignore it, you're increasing the probability of it, and therefore it repeatedly happens. So we repeatedly have financial crises, each one worse than the last.
Markets are supposed to be magnificent because they increase your choices. Actually, they restrict your choices. You think about it for a minute. Suppose I want to get home from work at night. Okay, the market offers me a choice. I can have a Ford or a Toyota. It does not offer me the choice of a Subway. What I want, what's good for me, what's good for the environment, what's good for my children, but that's not offered in the market. Markets offer individual consumption. And the enormous stress on the importance of markets is part of the way to drive people towards looking for yourself, amassing as many commodities as you can, forget everything else. In fact, if you think about it, every one of you has taken an economics course or read about it, then you know what markets are supposed to be. Markets are supposed to be systems in which informed consumers make rational choices, right? I'm sure every one of you has turned on a television set. Now, what do you see when you turn on a television set? You see that there's a huge industry, public relations industry, which began in the United States and Britain, incidentally, huge industry which is designed to undermine markets. Every ad is an attempt to create an uninformed consumer who will make an irrational choice, right? Huge effort on the part of the business world to undermine markets, but to keep the aspect that's useful for profit and power, namely separating people from one another, focusing on individual choices, not working with your neighbor.
What's called neoliberalism is an attack on democracy and is an open attack on democracy. It's not secret. The goal is to minimize the state. And if you minimize the state, you're maximizing something else. What is the thing that you're maximizing? Well, private tyranny. The state is the arena within which the public has some role, at least in principle, in determining policy. In the private sector, it has no role. So the more that the public arena is minimized and private power is maximized, the less you have democracy. Now, personally, in my view, the state is an illegitimate institution, should be dismantled, but not as long as private power is there, because that's much worse. That's a system which is unaccountable to the public. And the main thrust of neoliberalism is precisely that. It's to restrict the arena within which the public can make some difference. My suggestion is to extend the public arena, and in the classic fashion, namely, as I said before, working people should have control of the places in which they work, not private tyrants. The people of a community should have control of their community, and they should interact with one another. That increases the public sphere. If the heavy concentration of private power is eliminated, then I think moves towards dismantling the entire state system are entirely proper. But you face the world that you're in right now. Incidentally, these neoliberal moves are not moves towards establishing a market system. A private corporation is outside the market system. If you look at world trade, take say the United States, about half of U.S. trade is not trade at all. It's just transactions internal to a corporation run by a very visible hand, which just happen to cross borders. So half of U.S. exports to Mexico don't even enter the Mexican economy. They're just parts are being assembled in the United States, transferred to Mexico to another branch of, say, the same Ford Motor Company. It's called exports. They come back to the United States, called imports. That's not trade. That's mercantilism. And that's a huge part of world trade. It's kind of corporate mercantilism in which the market is functioning only at the margins and functioning mostly to control people. The ones who are running the world economy have protected themselves very strongly from market discipline. In fact, if you look at the top, there are some good studies by good economists of transnational corporations. And there's one major study by two British economists of the top 100 transnational corporations. Every one of them has benefited from the interventionist policies of its home government, and 20 of the 100 have been saved from complete collapse by state takeover and bailout. Over and above that, the corporation itself is out of the market system. Its internal transactions are centrally directed. These are command economies. So you have the neoliberal system is an attack, in my view, both on the market and on democracy.
The consequences of the austerity agenda are pretty obvious. They're in Europe, where they're being imposed more strictly, they're devastating the societies. These are rich societies. They're increasing debt as anticipated. They're creating a huge number of unemployed. In the United States, which is in this case more progressive than Europe, they're being applied, but less rigorously, and they're having a milder version of the same effects. It's not because people want it. So like in the United States, for example, where there's plenty of polls, the general population considers the main problem to be unemployment, not deficit. And they're right. In fact, the deficit's probably a good idea right now. It's a stimulus to the economy, and it's a way to create more jobs. Even the IMF is coming around to accept this. So who wants austerity? Well, bankers, rich people, the people who run the world. They want austerity. There's recent studies came out by good political scientist Ben Page and Larry Bartels, in which they just studied attitudes towards deficit, austerity, and jobs ranked by income level, and it's exactly as you'd predict. The very top of the income scale, the problem is deficits, so we have to have austerity. The rest of the population doesn't agree. And we don't have a functioning democracy. We live in a plutocracy. About roughly 70% of the population, lower 70%, their views have no influence on policy. They're disenfranchised. And you get more influence as you go up the scale. At the very top, that means, 1/10 of 1%, basically get what you want. Well, what they want is, they don't care if kids don't have schools or, don't get Medicaid or don't have Head Start. They want to make profit.
What's happened in Europe in the past 10 or 20 years is just astonishing. I mean, even the Wall Street Journal is astonished. They pointed out recently in an article that, which is correct, that in Europe, no matter what government is elected, far left, far right, anything else, they follow exactly the same policies because they have no role in setting policy. The policies are set by the bureaucrats in Brussels under the shadow of the Bundesbank. So it doesn't matter what people think. In fact, there are some dramatic illustrations of that. A couple of years ago, the Greek Prime Minister, Papandreou, meekly suggested that maybe there should be a referendum in Greece so that people could say whether they wanted to accept the policies that were being dictated to them. He was denounced across the spectrum. Everybody denounced him as totally crazy. Now, how can you dare ask the population what policies ought to be? In Europe, we know that policies have to be set by the bureaucrats and the bankers. Most of you have, say, iPhones or something like that in your pocket. Take a look at them. For example, they have in them a GPS. Where'd the GPS come from? It's created by the U.S. Navy, the Navistar program. It has microelectronics, software, hardware, almost all created for decades, mostly in the state sector, under often in the U.S. Pentagon funding, here the counterpart. Taxpayers pay for this because they think they're protecting their security. That's what they're told. But in fact, the government doesn't care about your security. What it cares is about its own power and security for corporate power. And the way the system works is the taxpayer takes the risks, carries out the investment for decades, literally decades. Finally, something may come out which is profitable, and then the profit goes to the private sector. If we had anything remotely like capitalist systems, we don't, they would adhere to the capitalist principle that if an investor takes risks and invests and waits and takes risky steps, and if something comes out of it, the profit goes back to the investor. That's not the way it works here. The profit goes to people who had nothing to do with it. The risks are taken by you, often through the Pentagon and comparable systems, and if anything comes out, the profits go to Microsoft and Apple. Now, they didn't create it. They take it. It's given to them. And it literally is decades. So computers were the computer market, personal computer market, became viable in 1977, I think it was. Apple was the first. That was about 30 years after the development of computers, almost all in the state sector, like in the building where I work. And if you buy pharmaceuticals, let's say, the basic research and development is pretty much done in the state sector. Places like probably the biology lab right here probably gets government funding, grants, and that's all across the board. When you look back at these, I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One part of that was leaked by WikiLeaks. It's secret except for the corporate lawyers and lobbyists, but one part was leaked. It was the part on intellectual property. Intellectual property is a polite term, a kind of a euphemism for government instituted monopoly pricing rights. That's what it really means. It means extraordinarily high patent rights, which have never existed in history, for the pharmaceutical corporations and some other corporations. That's to keep the price of drugs up and make profits astronomical. Now there's a pretext. The pharmaceutical corporations say, look, we need that for research and development. Well, that's been investigated. Turns out that probably at least half of the R&D is not done by the pharmaceutical corporations at all. It's done by the state sector and so on. And that's an underestimate, because if you take a close look, the part that's done by the pharmaceutical corporations is towards the marketing end, like, flip around a molecule to get a new drug. But the basic research, the hard, costly, risky research, that's done by people like you. You pay for it through your taxes, and the pharmaceutical corporations rip off the profit.
I mean, the period when the press was most free was about the mid-19th century. I mean, at that time, just keeping to say England and the United States, the two cases that have been studied, I imagine it's the same elsewhere. In the mid-19th century, there was a very lively, popular press, very widely read by, working people, by everyone, but, much reached far beyond the commercial media at the time. It was very diverse. It represented, it reflected public interests and public concerns, and it was very popular. In Britain, they tried to close it down by censorship of various kinds, but that didn't work. There were too many ways to avoid it. And it was finally understood that the way to eliminate it was by advertising, by reliance on advertising and by concentration of capital. So just through the effect of reliance on advertising, which was then just a, kind of beginning, like around a century ago, and concentration of capital, they realized that over time they could marginalize the independent popular press, which couldn't get the advertising, of course, because advertisers don't like what they were saying, and didn't have the capital. And it took a long time. So in England, it was actually up until about 40 years ago, still the case 40 years ago, that the main newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, was a kind of labor-oriented, social democratic newspaper, very popular. Everybody had outsold all the others. The Mirror, which was the main tabloid, was the same, kind of leftist paper, popular paper, but they kind of succumbed to advertising pressure and capital control. The United States happened a bit earlier, but it was the same process. And advertising is, it's part of a much bigger industry. Advertising is part of the public relations industry, which is a huge industry. And it developed very consciously around the First World War in the two most democratic countries, England and the United States. And there's a good reason for it. They were coming to as the countries were becoming more free, that just through popular struggle, and people were winning the franchise, and you couldn't shut them up anymore by force, it was understood that you're going to have to control people by controlling opinion and attitudes, because we can't rely on force anymore. And control of opinion and attitudes means, there was actually a phrase for it. This was the time when what was called scientific management of work was becoming a big issue, Taylorite management, Ford and all that stuff. But it was also understood you want to not only control very closely the lives of people in their work time, but also you have to control them in their off-work time. And what you have to do is turn them into passive, obedient consumers who don't pay, don't try to get out of our hair, basically. Pay attention to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. You get them trapped into consumerism, isolated from one another, atomized, control their beliefs. That's where notions like manufacture of consent come from right after this First World War. And out of this came huge industries. And advertising is a large part of it, but and it of course affects the media enormously. I mean, if any of you are, if you watch television, for example, take say television, when you turn on the television set, the corporation doesn't make any money, right? Like you don't pay them when you turn it on unless it's cable, but they do. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because of the advertising. So the resources and the creativity and the effort and so on in the whole television industry goes into advertising. In fact, within the television industry, there are words called content and fill. Like a program has content and a program has fill. The content is the advertising. The fill is the car chase that's in there to keep you watching until the next ad comes along. And all the effort, of course, goes into the advertising. And the fill has first of all, it's to keep your interest enough so you watch the advertising, but the advertising is there for a purpose. I mean, it's to turn people into creatures whose only concern in life is to max out their 5 credit cards and not to pay attention to what's going on in the world and let the rich, powerful guys do what they want without interference.
Mainstream media gives essentially the same message because why?
Well, we have to look what the message is. First of all, the message is one of remarkable subordination to power. Now, power in the United States doesn't happen to be in the state. It's not a centralized military bureaucratic state like in the Soviet Union. Right. Power in the United States primarily lies in corporations, in the corporate world. There's very narrow concentration of control over resources, over investment decisions, and so on and so forth. And that affects everything. Can't help affecting everything. It affects the government because this means that there's a very close link between governmental power and corporate power. Furthermore, just the ability to make investment decisions and financial decisions places bounds on what any government could do.
Yes.
Furthermore, now let's go to the major media. what are the major media? Well, they're huge corporations. Okay, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, they first of all are large corporations, quite profitable ones, in fact. Secondly, they're parts of even bigger conglomerates, like, Westinghouse and GE and so on. Now, like any corporation, they sell a product on a market. This is a market, roughly a kind of a state-guided market society. What's the product and what's the market? Well, the market's advertisers. That is other businesses. So they're selling a product to other businesses. Corporations are selling a product to other businesses. What's the product? Well, the product is audiences. Now, for the major media, the ones that kind of set the agenda, they're selling elite audiences, privileged audiences. The New York Times, say, is targeting privileged elite sectors of the population. That's their audience, and they're trying to sell that audience to other businesses. Now, so we have to begin with, just on the most elementary grounds, we look at a system. Suppose we're Martians. We're looking at this system. We say, okay, here are huge corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what picture of the world do you expect to come out of that? Then we begin to add other factors. If let's say you're the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, or a pundit on the op-ed page, and you want to really have important insights into the government. Well, we all know how that's done. You have lunch with the Secretary of State. He tells you the lies that he wants to appear tomorrow. You write them and you say, a high source in Washington. My intrepid reporting has discovered that a high source in Washington said so-and-so. In fact, if you compare the internal declassified record, of, say, people like Dean Acheson's decisions, and you look at, say, James Reston's columns, they're pretty close. And the same will be true about James Baker and Thomas Friedman. And furthermore, this is an open secret. We know that this is the way. It's not a big secret in the journalistic profession that this is. Now, in order to maintain those contacts, you better present the world a certain way, or those contacts are going to be cut off. You'll lose your opportunity to have to appear, to have special insight, to have leaks, to be able to come across with a story, a couple hours before the next person, and so on. Plus, now, in order, there's an interplay here which requires power in order to maintain your own power. That's another factor over and above the just structural and institutional properties. The militias are just, in this so-called patriot movement, is just one aspect. Notice, first of all, that their slogans are very much like what the whole propaganda system has been trying to ram at your heads for 50 years. The government is the enemy, and private power doesn't exist. Okay? Now, it's obvious why big corporations who are fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men would want that to be the picture you have. If the government is your enemy, and you can, let's say, when 83% of the population think the economic system is inherently unfair, that's supposed to mean they're angry at the government. If you can take that view, then those who run the private institutions are quite well off. There's no threat of democracy. They can run things peacefully. The people are demoralized, and the normal methods of democratic participation to gain social ends are excluded. So it makes good sense for corporate propaganda, which means most of what we see and hear. It makes a good sense for it to be trying to stress the message that the government is the enemy, and to de-stress, in fact, eliminate from sight the fact that private power exists. So government is the enemy, everybody else is in harmony. That's been the message. Well, the militias just take that a step further. They kind of take it to its logical extension. Yeah, okay, government's the enemy, let's blow up the federal building. Okay? So in a sense, they're kind of hearing the indoctrination and taking it literally. Well, it also has deeper roots in American history, but apart from that, remember that this is a very cult-ridden society. The militias are a cult, and they're only one, and by no means the major one. People are isolated, they're atomized, they don't believe in the political system, and they don't take part in it. They don't organize in other ways. The unions are very weak, which have been the leading democratizing force in most of modern history. This kind of constructive civil society has been very much demolished. It's kind of striking to compare the richest country in the world, the United States, with the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, namely Haiti, where you know, peasants and people in the slums and so on, did construct and have sustained, amazingly, a very lively, vibrant civil society with grassroots organizations and unions and all sorts of things, and had an effect. I mean, they got their own president into office. Well, that conception of democracy has been knocked out of people's heads here. We could do well to go to the Haitian slums and try to learn something about what democracy is. But here it's kind of, it has been very much dissolved. People feel lonely, isolated, atomized, you know, me in the tube, they don't do anything with anyone else. The normal methods of interchange and constructive action, like for example unions or political organizations, barely, you know, are very weak by comparative standards. Well, how do people react to that? Well, one of the ways they react is people just don't give up. You know, they form other ways of associating. And the other ways of associating are often extremely irrational. I think that's a reflection of the dissolution of functioning civil society and constructive ways of responding. The militias are just one piece of it, and they happen to be picking out the major theme of the propaganda system. You can't say they invented it. That's exactly what people are told all the time. Yeah, government's the enemy. You can't do anything through the political system because it's your enemy. So therefore let us, we who run the private system, let us run everything and don't bother us. Okay, that's essentially what they're doing. So they're not inventing it. They're just exaggerating something that has been the primary theme of propaganda for 50 years. And doing it in a way which you can kind of understand in a dissolving society where there's plenty of other, and in fact much bigger and more, I think, more dangerous cults developing. Well, you know, all of that can be reversed. It's happened in the past, and it's been reversed. Unions were much worse off in the 1920s, and they barely existed. In the 1890s, I mean, not only didn't they exist, they were being, you know, people trying to organize were simply being murdered by security forces. In fact, that went on into the 1930s here, okay? Things are better than they were, you know? But it can be recovered the way it's been recovered in the past. That's why we live in a better country than it was 60 years ago, much better than it was 100 years ago.
Professor Chomsky, I think one of the reasons that you see crowds like this is people are interested in hearing these things that don't get said very often and generally agree that, gee, these are bad things. How could the U.S. government be involved in them? Why do you think it is that most of the people feel one way, and yet our leaders invariably, and you cited Democratic and Republican leaders, all of them, I mean, across the board, you said Carter, Clinton, both Bushes, Reagan. Why do you think it is that our leaders don't feel the same way that we do?
Yeah, I don't want to overgeneralize. There are a lot of different people in Congress and the White House and so on, but by and large, overwhelmingly, they simply respond to different interests. 75% of the population who was skeptical of the election were basically correct. Policy is determined by power, by concentration of domestic power. And it's not a big secret how power is concentrated domestically. It's concentrated in huge conglomerates, which are internally tyrannies, in effect. They're mostly unaccountable to the public. They're given enormous rights, far beyond the rights of persons. They're linked to one another in all kinds of alliances. They have an overwhelming effect on state policy, which largely keeps to what they want. So and if they happen to differ, you know, if there's splits among them, you get things coming up in elections. Where they agree, it doesn't come up. Like some of the major issues for the U.S. population are things like the international economic agreements, what are called trade agreements, so they don't have much to do with trade, or say the free trade area of the Americas or the trade deficit and so on. These are really top issues. They don't come up in the elections. And they don't come up in the elections for a very simple reason. The business world is on one side, and the population is on the other side. Very largely, and they know it. So like in the Wall Street Journal, they say, you know, the problem is if these things come up, opponents of these agreements have what they call an ultimate weapon, namely the general population. So therefore we have to keep them from coming up. And they don't come up in elections, and they're not discussed. And the population more or less knows that, even if they don't know all the details about, you know, GATS and so on. Yeah, except, you know, anyone who tries to break out of that rather rigid framework is going to be marginalized. because they don't have the resources and they don't control they don't have the media and they don't have the organization and so on. It's going to take large popular movements to change this. And that can happen. It's happened in the past. I mean, that's why freedom and justice have expanded over the centuries. It's never been gifts. You know, it wasn't gifts from the rich and powerful. These are things that were won. You know, they were won by the labor movement and by the women's movement and by the civil rights movement and by human rights movements. They're won by popular struggle. Then you get you move forward. But they're never given as gifts, and they won't be in the future.
So that leads to that critical question, Professor Chomsky. How do we fight back? How do we win?
We fight back the way they did in the 1930s, the way the populist movement did in the 1890s, and the labor movement then finally defeated, but not without a lot of victories. The way the civil rights movement worked, again with significant victories, though certainly not what Martin Luther King was trying to achieve. You organize, you try. First, you have to educate, like what you're doing on, on your activities. Then you have to, which includes educating yourself, and then you have to try to organize, get people mobilized to do something, as say the Occupy movement did and has done and might continue to do, and then carry out actions of the kind that threaten power and require a response, like say CIO sit-down strikes. And there are plenty of other things you can do. So, for example, some things are going on kind of quietly in the country, which have potentially a kind of, even revolutionary implications. The growth and development of cooperatives and worker-owned enterprises, for example. It's not on a huge scale, but it's on a significant scale and spreading. And those are what could be germs of a new society, a very different society, undermining capitalist social and economic relations. Well, all of those, on all sorts of fronts, there are things that can be done, and sometimes they're successful. I mean, for example, the 1960s activism had quite a civilizing effect on the country. It did evoke a tremendous backlash from the 1970s, and we're living in the midst of that backlash, but there are plenty of achievements. Many of them were carried forward. Some are being carried forward right now. Say the advance of gay rights, or much too limited, but at least some concern about the environment. All of those things are developing. They can go further. So there's no shortage of things to do. They're the kinds of tasks that have always been in front of people who wanted to make a better world. Not easy ones, but they're not impossible either. There's successes in the past that we can build on.
The political system increasingly functions without public input. It means to an increasing extent, not only do people not ratify decisions presented to them, but they don't even participate, but they don't even take the trouble of ratifying them. They assume that the decisions are going on independently of what they may do in the polling booth.
And they feel...
Notice that even ratification of decisions made elsewhere is a very weak form of democracy.
Ratification would be what?
Well, ratification would mean a system in which there are two positions presented to me, the voter. I go into the polling booth and I push one or another button depending on which of those positions I want. That's a very limited form of democracy. A really meaningful democracy would mean that I play a role in forming those decisions and creating those positions, that those positions reflect my active, creative participation at not just me, but of course everyone. That would be real democracy.
That's not
We're very far from that. Yeah. In a capitalist democracy, you have the problem, and it is always perceived as a problem, that the general population has a method of participating in decision-making. They can participate in politics. The state is not capable of stopping them. You can't shut them up. You can't put them in jail. You can't keep them away from the polls and so on. And it's striking that that has always been perceived as a problem to be overcome. It's what's called the crisis of democracy. too many people organizing themselves to become, to enter the public arena. That's a crisis. So therefore, we have to have what Walter Lippmann, back in 1920 or so, called manufacture of consent. We have to ensure that actual decision-making, actual power is in the hands of what he called a specialized class, us smart guys. We're going to make the right decisions. And we've got to keep the general population marginalized because they're always going to make mistakes.
Marginalizing meaning?
Reduce them to apathy and obedience. Allow them to participate in the political system, but as consumers, not as true participants. That is, allow them a method for ratifying decisions that are made by others, but eliminate the methods by which they might first inform themselves, second organize, and third act in such a way as to really control decision-making. That is, the idea is our leaders control us, not we control them. The doctrines of the Enlightenment held that individuals should be free from the coercion of concentrated power. Now, the kind of concentrated power that they were thinking about was the church and the state and the feudal system and so on. And you could sort of imagine a population of relatively equal people, at least equal white male property owners, who would be not controlled by those private powers. But in the subsequent period, a new form of power developed, namely corporations, with highly concentrated power over decision-making in economic life. That is, they control over what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on and so forth, is very narrowly concentrated.
So this is why the vice president of a large corporation would say the public mind is the chief thing.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country, rather, and own its institutions. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. If we were to move towards democracy, and I think democracy even in the 18th century since, we would say that there should be no maldistribution of power in determining what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on. Rather, that should be, that's a problem for the entire community. In fact, there are, in my own personal view, unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive.
Why?
Well, we now face the most awesome problems of human history, problems such as the likelihood of nuclear conflict, either among the superpowers or through proliferation, the destruction of a fragile environment, which finally we're beginning to recognize that was obvious decades ago that we're heading for disaster. Other problems of this nature, they're of a level of seriousness that they never were in the past.
But why do you think more participation by the public, more democracy is the answer?
Because, well, more democracy is a value in itself. So quite apart from, because democracy is a value, it doesn't have to be defended any more than freedom has to be defended. It's just, it's part of, it's an essential feature of human nature that people should be free, they should be able to participate, they should be uncoerced, and so on.
So
these are values in themselves.
Right. Why do you think, if we go that route,
because I think that that's the only hope that I can see that other values will come to the fore. I mean, if the society is based on control by private wealth, it will reflect the values that it in fact does reflect, the value that the highest, the only real human property is the desire is greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of others. Now, any society, maybe a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, and that's what we are. We have to have a mode of social organization that reflects other values that I think are inherent in human nature that people recognize.
And that would be, I want to see exactly what you mean.
I mean, what are human beings? I mean, in your family, for example, it's not the case that in the family every person tries to maximize personal gain at the expense of others, or if they do, it's kind of pathological. It's not the case that if you and I are, say, walking down the street and we see a child eating a piece of candy and we see that nobody's around, and we happen to be hungry, we don't steal it. If we did that, we would be pathological. I mean, the idea of care for others and concern for other people's needs and concern for a fragile environment that must sustain future generations, all of these things are part of human nature. These are elements of human nature that are suppressed in a social and cultural system which is designed to maximize personal gain. And I think we must try to overcome that suppression, and that's in fact what democracy could bring about. It could lead to the expression of other human needs and values which tend to be suppressed under the institutional structure of a system of private power and private profit. If a real democracy is going to thrive, if the real values that are deeply embedded in human nature are going to be able to flourish, and I think that's necessary to save us, if nothing else, it's an absolute necessity that groups form in which people can join together, can share their concerns, can articulate their ideas, can gain a response, can discover what they think, can discover what they believe, what their values are. This can't be imposed on you from above. You have to discover it by experiment, by effort, by trial, by application, and so on. And this has to be done with others. Furthermore, surely central to human nature is a need to be engaged with others in cooperative efforts of solidarity and concern. That can only happen, almost by definition, through group structures. And unless such
political organization,
political and others,
civic organizations,
all sorts,
trade associations.
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which people can associate with one another. And I think what I would like to see is a move towards a society which is really based on proliferating voluntary organization, with eliminating as much as possible structures of hierarchy and domination and the basis for them in ownership and control, and becoming the means by which we govern ourselves, by which we control our lives.
Let me begin by saying something about liberalism, which is a very complicated concept. I think it's correct, surely, that liberalism grew up in the intellectual environment of empiricism and the rejection of authority and trust in the evidence of the senses and so on. However, liberalism has undergone a very complex evolution as a social philosophy over the years. If we go back to the classics, or at least what I regard as the classics, say, for example, Humboldt's Limits of State Action, which inspired Mill and is a true liberal classic, if you like. The world that Humboldt was considering, which was partially an imaginary world, but the world for which he was developing this political philosophy was a post-feudal but pre-capitalist world. That it was a world in which there is no great divergence among individuals in the kind of power that they have and what they command, let's say. But there was a tremendous disparity between individuals on the one hand and the state on the other. Consequently, it was the task of a liberalism that was concerned with human rights and equality of individuals and so on. It was the task of that liberalism to dissolve the enormous power of the state, which was such an authoritarian threat to individual liberties. And from that you develop a classical liberal theory in, say, Humboldt's or Mill's sense. Well, of course, that is pre-capitalist. He couldn't conceive of an era in which a corporation would be regarded as an individual, let's say, or in which enormous disparities in control over resources and production would distinguish between individuals in a massive fashion. Now, in that kind of society, to take the Humboldtian view is a very superficial liberalism, because while opposition to state power in an era of such divergence conforms to Humboldt's conclusions, it doesn't do so for his reasons. That is, his reasons lead to very different conclusions in that case. Namely, I think his reasons lead to the conclusion that we must dissolve the authoritarian control over production and resources, which leads to such divergences among individuals. In fact, I think one might draw a direct line between classical liberalism and a kind of libertarian socialism, which I think can be regarded as a kind of an adapting of the basic reasoning of classical liberalism to a very different social era. Now, if we come to the modern period, here liberalism has taken on a very strange sense if you think of its history. Now liberalism is essentially the theory of state capitalism, of state intervention in a capitalist economy. Well, that has very little relation to classical liberalism. In fact, classical liberalism is what's now called conservatism, I suppose. But this new view, I think, really is, in my view at least, a highly authoritarian position. That is, it's one which accepts a number of centers of authority and control, the state on the one hand,
agglomerations of private power, on the other hand, all interacting with individuals as malleable cogs in this highly constrained machine, which may be called democratic, but given the actual distribution of power is very far from being meaningfully democratic and cannot be so. So my own feeling has always been that to achieve the classical liberal ideals for the reasons that led to them being put forth in a society so different, we must be led in a very different direction. It's superficial and erroneous to accept the conclusions which were reached for a different society and not to consider the reasoning that led to those conclusions. The reasoning, I think, is very substantial. I'm a classical liberal in this sense, but I think it leads me to be a kind of an anarchist, an anarchist socialist. Anarchism is a point of view which, first of all, it covers a lot of things. Political rhetoric is not the clearest, it's not a model of clarity, and anarchism has covered quite a lot of ground, but the mainstream of it has just been the basic principle, which I think comes straight out of classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, that any form of authority and domination has a burden of proof to bear. It has to demonstrate that it's legitimate, no matter what it is, whether it's inside a family or in the global economy. If it is a form of authority and domination and coercion, it has to show that it's legitimate. If it can demonstrate it's legitimate, and it's a heavy burden to bear. If it shows that it's legitimate, okay. If not, it ought to be dismantled. That's anarchism.
Okay. Now, what is considered legitimate authority?
It's the task of those who have the authority to demonstrate that. Suppose I'm taking a walk with my granddaughter and she runs out into the street, okay, and I grab her and pull her back. Well, that's authority, and it's my task to demonstrate that it's legitimate. And I think in this case, if anybody challenged me, I could make an argument saying that's legitimate authority. But the burden of proof is always on those who exercise it. That's true if it's men and women, parents and children, owners and people they rent, the state and people who serve it, the IMF and people who follow its orders, wherever it is. So there's no general definition of what legitimate authority is. It's the task of those who exercise authority to demonstrate their legitimacy. They're the ones who have the burden of proof. And if they can't meet that burden by explaining why what they do is legitimate, then they have no right to exercise the authority. And whatever institution, any institution within which they exercise it is illegitimate unless they show otherwise. And the anarchists are just people who believe that and try to do something about it.
So the members of that institution, is it their responsibility to make a judgment call about the authority of the person who is trying to prove their legitimate authority?
Well, I don't mean that every minute of the day everybody has to be saying, look, this is my legitimate authority, but they have to be prepared to meet the challenge.
Sure.
So if it's like suppose it's a formally democratic state, well, in principle, that challenge is met by interchange among the population, which recognizes the authority of actions in the public arena through constant interaction, debate, struggle, and so on. In theory, that's what happens if it is a democratic state. To the extent that that doesn't happen, it's not a democratic state and it is illegitimate. When you move to other systems of authority, like, say, private corporations or fascist states or other forms of totalitarianism, there's no question of legitimacy because they have none.
Right. So, but it's the responsibility of the other people in that institution, whatever that institution might be, to question and to challenge.
No, it's not their responsibility. It's their responsibility to meet the challenge. It's the responsibility of people to make the challenge. So it's the responsibility of, say, women to challenge a framework in which they are supposed to wash the dishes and put the children to sleep and that sort of thing. And it's the responsibility of men in a traditional patriarchic family to answer that challenge. I mean, it would be nice if the challenge could be raised by those in positions of authority, but that's pretty rare. I mean, usually when you're in a position of authority, you kind of internalize the values that say it's right and just. And the reason is because most people are sort of decent human beings, And it's very hard to to look in the mirror and say, I'm a bastard. So usually what you do is look in the mirror and say, I'm a nice guy, and I do these things because it's right and just and legitimate. And that's pretty standard, you know. I mean, everybody knows that from their own experience. We don't have to go into it. That's what people are like. And therefore the responsibility of raising the challenge is typically in the hands of those who recognize that they have a subordinate status. It's very hard to recognize that. I mean, people live, you know, for millennia, you know, without recognizing that they are being subordinated in systems of power. I mean, that's true of women, for example. Or slaves, you know. I mean, most slave societies were accepted by the slaves as legitimate and in fact necessary. A large part, and the same is true of, for example, people who have jobs today in our society. Almost without exception, they consider it legitimate for them to be in a position where they have to rent themselves in order to survive. It's certainly not obvious, you know. And in fact, if you go back a century ago, it was not only considered not obvious, it was considered outlandish by American working people. I'm not talking about Marxists or socialists or anybody like that, but say mill hands in Lowell, Massachusetts, who never heard of socialism, who regarded it as a form of slavery and were complaining that they had not fought the Civil War to replace chattel slavery by wage slavery, and that therefore those who work in the mills ought to own them. Because that's the Republican rights that we won in the American Revolution and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's not obvious. But by now, I think enough indoctrination and propaganda and so on has taken place, so people do regard that form of subordination to external authority as legitimate. Whether they should is another question. But the fact is they do, just as for most of history, women have accepted a subordinate role as correct and proper and so on, and slaves did, and people living in, say, feudal societies. In a feudal society, people had a place, you know, some kind of role, and quite typically the societies were stable because people regarded those structures as legitimate. The same is true of religious structures and I mean, throughout human life, there's a whole variety of systems of authority and oppression and domination and so on, which are usually accepted as legitimate by the people subordinated to them. When they don't, you have struggles and revolutions and sometimes changes and sometimes brutality and so on. As far as I understand it, anarchists are just people who take this seriously.
Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian, throughout modern European history, meant socialist and anarchist. It meant the socialist movement, the workers' movement and the socialist movement, they sort of broke into two branches, roughly. One statist, one anti-statist. The statist branch led to Bolshevism and Lenin and Trotsky and so on. The anti-statist branch, which included Marxists, left Marxists, Pannekoek, Rosa Luxemburg, others, kind of merged more or less into an amalgam with a big strain of anarchism into what was called Libertarian Socialism. So libertarian in Europe always meant socialist. Here it means ultra, you know, Ayn Rand or Cato Institute or something like that. But that's a special U.S. usage having to do with a lot of things quite special about the way the United States developed, and this is part of it. There it meant, and always meant to me, socialist, anti-state, the anti-state branch of socialism, which meant a highly organized society, completely organized, and nothing to do with chaos, but based on a democracy all the way through. That means democratic control of communities, of workplaces, of federal structures built on systems of voluntary association spreading internationally. That's traditional anarchism, at least, you know,
anybody can have the word if they like, but it's a mainstream, probably the mainstream of traditional anarchism, and it has roots. Coming back to the United States, it has very strong roots in the American working class movements. So if you go back to, say, the 1850s, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, so right around the area where I live, in eastern Massachusetts, textile plants and so on, the people working in those plants were in part young women coming off the farms. They were called factory girls. So the women come to the farms and work in the textile plant. Some of them were Irish, immigrants in Boston, and that group of people. They had an extremely rich and interesting culture. They're kind of like my uncle, who never went past fourth grade. Very educated. Reading modern literature. They didn't bother with European radicalism. That had no effect on them. But the general literary culture they were very much part of, and they developed their own conceptions of how the world ought to be organized. They had their own newspapers. In fact, the period of the freest press in the United States was probably around the 1850s. In the 1850s, the scale of the popular press, meaning run by factory girls in Lowell and so on, was the scale of the commercial press, or even greater. And these were independent newspapers, a lot of interesting scholarship on them. You can read them now. They were not known, just spontaneously, without any background, and they never heard of Marx or Bakunin or anyone else. They developed the same ideas. They thought that from their point of view, what they called wage slavery, renting yourself to an owner, was not very different from chattel slavery, what they were fighting the Civil War about. And you have to recall that in the mid-19th century, that was a common view in the United States. For example, it was the position of the Republican Party. It was Abraham Lincoln's position. It's not an odd view, but there isn't much difference between selling yourself and renting yourself. So the idea of renting yourself, meaning working for wages, was degrading. It was just an attack on your personal integrity. And they despised the industrial system that was developing, that was destroying their culture, destroying their independence, their individuality, constraining them to be subordinate to masters, there was a tradition of what was called republicanism in the United States. We're free people, the first free people in the world. This was destroying and undermining that freedom. And this was the core of the labor movement all over, and included in it was the assumption, just taken for granted, that those, I'm quoting, those who work in the mills should run them. In fact, one of their main slogans, I'll just quote it, was they condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That idea that the new spirit, that you should only be interested in gaining wealth and forgetting about your relations to other people, they regarded as just a violation of fundamental human nature and a degrading idea. Like, take, for example, one of the most successful industrial commercial installations in Spain, quite big, in fact, Mondragon. It's a big collection of industrial works, schools, social systems, health systems, and so on. Very substantial, very successful. It's one of the few parts of the Spanish economy that's competitive internationally, even after joining European Union. It's worker-owned, and it's partially socialist anarchist. It's worker-owned, but manager-controlled. Workers pick the managers, but they theoretically at least control the managers. How much they control them, you can debate. But there's no outside investors telling them what to do. They have their own banks, their own development banks, they have their own social services and so on, and it's been dramatically successful. Well, okay, that's pieces of a more free and democratic society. Pieces only, because workers are not really participating directly. They're still picking somebody to tell them what to do, at least they're picking them, and they have the authority, ultimately, which in principle they could use. Well, okay, that's a piece of a democratic society. And you find pieces of democratic societies all over the place. Very often in periods of revolution, very democratic societies emerge fast and spontaneously and similarly, like workers' councils to control industry. They come up all the time. I mean, they come up after the Bolshevik Revolution. They were immediately crushed by, actually before the Bolshevik Revolution, they developed and they were immediately crushed by Lenin and Trotsky. In Italy at the same time, they developed, after the Hungarian Revolution, they developed in Spain. They not only developed but flourished. In fact, these things have happened over and over again spontaneously. The reason is it's unnatural. You don't have to read big books to think that the workers in a plant ought to get together and run it. In fact, you go back to 19th century America, you know, the mill towns around here, the workers were saying, factory girls, as they called them, young women from the farms, or, you know, local craftsmen, the mills ought to be run by the workers who are owned and run by the workers in them. That's just natural. That's like saying that people should vote their own representatives in Congress. Well, okay, those natural ideas are crushed, but there's no reason why they can't be realized and implemented.
Okay, I mean, the principle, as far as I can see, goes right back to the Enlightenment. You know, like if you go back to classical Enlightenment thought, I'm not talking about Adam Smith and, you know, Jefferson and those guys. The sort of core idea is that people have the right to control their own work. You know, okay, that if a person, here I'll quote a standard formula back in the 18th century, you know, leading heroes of the Enlightenment, is if a person works on, if a person does beautiful work under external command, meaning for wages, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, because he's not a free human being. Okay, that goes all the way through classical liberal thought, Enlightenment thought. I mean, you know, Alexis de Tocqueville says, under wage labor, the art advances, the artisan declines. Now, you find this going right into the working class movements in Lowell and Lawrence. I think that's just natural. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of it. It seems to me if you think about it, yeah, why should you work on command? I mean, if you work on command, you're some kind of slave. You know? Why not work because it's coming out of your needs and interests? I mean, like, cheap for me to say, I'm in a fancy university in a science department and I can do that. One of the nice things about being in science as a fancy university is you really do have workers' control. To a very large extent, we control what we do. You know, want to work on this topic, I work on that topic. I mean, you got to sell it to funders and this and that, but the degree of workers' control at the elite level is quite substantial. I mean, that's why it's such a privilege to be in a science department. You know, enormously privileged existence. Forget the money. If they paid you 1/10 the amount of money, it would still be a much better existence than working on command. Now, I think people do know that. You know, I don't think that these Enlightenment ideas are hard to grasp. I think people know that if you work under external control, you may admire what the person does, but despise what he is, because his labor, you know, the sort of central part of your life, is being done at somebody else's orders. And you're not controlling the way it's done, or why it's done, or how it's used, or anything else. Well, you can't have every individual controlling every single thing, but that's why you have democratic structures, because people control things together, you know. Okay, I don't know how to, I wouldn't try to convince anybody of this, because I frankly just don't believe that everyone doesn't know it. I think maybe I'm sentimental, but it seems to me if you sort of cut away waves of, you know, layers of distortion and delusion, these things that were considered pretty obvious 200 years ago are still obvious.
People are interested in linguistics for all sorts of reasons, but my own interest since the beginning, for 50 years, has been as a way of exploring some aspects of human higher mental faculties and ultimately of human nature, which should show up in every domain, not just in, I mean, language happens to be one of the few areas where you can study very core human capacities, unique and core human capacities in a very intense way, and achieve some
results that go beyond superficial understanding. In most areas, it's very hard to do it, but this is one area in which you can. At the core of this capacity for language, it's been recognized for centuries, is a kind of what was sometimes called a creative aspect, the free ability to do what you and I are doing, to express our thoughts without limit, within constraints, but without limit, in novel ways and so on. That's somehow a fundamental part of human nature. It's the core of Cartesian philosophy, was this ability, for example. Well, similar questions arise in every aspect of human capacity, and again, it's traditional. So David Hume, 250 years ago, pointed out that the foundation of morals must be what we nowadays call generative grammar. He didn't call it that, but it must be some set of principles that we're capable of applying in novel situations, again, without limit. And he pointed out these principles have to be part of our nature because there's no way to acquire them from experience. In theory, you can learn something about these aspects of human nature, and that, moving over to the domain of human affairs, including politics, but personal life or anything else, anyone who takes any stand on anything, say if you're in favor of keeping things the way they are, or some minor reform or revolution or whatever it may be. I mean, if you're serious about it, if you're acting as a kind of a moral agent, you think what you do should meet certain minimal moral standards. You're taking that position because you think it's good for people. It's going to somehow conform. It's going to bring out and amplify and offer possibilities for their fundamental nature to express itself. Well, at that point, there's a theoretical connection, but it's pretty abstract. Because when you deal with anything as complex as human beings, you're always on the surface. In fact, we can't answer questions like this about insects. It'll be a long time, if ever, before one can have anything like scientific understanding of any questions like these.
My own studies in language and human cognition demonstrate, to me at least, what remarkable creativity ordinary people have. The very fact that people talk to one another is a reflection, and just in the normal way, I don't mean anything particularly fancy, reflects deep-seated features of human creativity, which in fact separate human beings from any other biological system we know. If in fact our minds were a blank slate and experience wrote on them, we would be very impoverished creatures indeed. So the obvious hypothesis is that our language is the result of the unfolding of a genetically determined program. Well, plainly there are different languages. In fact, the apparent variation of languages is quite superficial. It's certain, as certain as anything else, is that humans are not genetically programmed to learn one or another language. So you bring up a Japanese baby in Boston, it'll speak Boston English, and you bring up my child in Japan, it'll speak Japanese. And that means that from that it simply follows by logic that the basic structure of the languages must be essentially the same. Our task as scientists is to try to determine exactly what those fundamental principles are that cause the knowledge of language to unfold in the manner in which it does under particular circumstances. And incidentally, I think there is no doubt the same must be true of other aspects of human intelligence and systems of understanding and interpretation and moral and aesthetic judgment and so on.
One consequence of your theories is that we are, as human beings, very, very rigidly pre-programmed. There are certain things we can understand, certain things we can communicate, and anything that falls outside that, we simply can't. Is that so?
That's certainly correct.
So, I mean, in a way, this is a rather alarming doctrine. I mean, it certainly contravenes the way we want to feel about ourselves.
Well, that may be an immediate reaction, but I think it's not the correct reaction. In fact, while it's true that our genetic program rigidly constrains us, I think the more important point is that the existence of that rigid constraint is what provides the basis for our freedom and creativity. And the reason...
What you mean, it's only because we're pre-programmed that we can do all the things we can do.
Exactly. The point is that if we really were plastic
organisms without an extensive pre-programming, then the state that our mind achieves would in fact be a reflection of the environment, which means it would be extraordinarily impoverished. Fortunately for us, we're rigidly pre-programmed with extremely rich systems that are part of our biological endowment. Correspondingly, a small amount of rather degenerate experience allows a kind of a great leap into a rich cognitive system, essentially uniform in a community, and in fact roughly uniform for the species.
Which would have developed over countless evolutionary ages through the biological
system,
evolutionary process.
Right. The basic system itself developed over long periods of evolutionary development. We don't know how, really. But for the individual, it's present. As a result, the individual is capable of, with a very small amount of evidence, of constructing an extremely rich system, which allows him to act in the free and creative fashion, which in fact is normal for humans. We can say anything that we want over an infinite range. Other people will understand us, though they've heard nothing like that before. We're able to do that precisely because of that rigid programming. But short of that, we would not be able to at all.
What account are you able to give of creativity? If we are pre-programmed in the way you say, then how is creativity a possibility for us?
Well, here I think one has to be fairly careful. I think we can say a good deal about the nature of the system that is acquired, the state of knowledge that is attained. We can say a fair amount about the biological, the basis in the initial state of the mind for the acquisition of this system. But when we turn to a third question, namely, how is this system used? How are we able to act creatively? How can we decide to say things that are new but not random, that are appropriate to occasions but not under the control of stimuli? When we ask these questions, we really enter into a realm of mystery where human science, at least so far, and maybe in principle, does not reach. We can say a fair amount about the principles that make it possible for us to behave in our normal creative fashion, but as soon as questions of will or decision or reason or choice of action, when those questions arise, human science is at a loss. It has nothing to say about them as far as I can see. These questions remain in the obscurity that in which they were in classical antiquity.
Would you also accept this, or not, that having arrived at our present situation across millions of years of evolution, we must have been going through a continual process of innovation and new adaptation and development of new abilities, dispositions, organs, etc. Might we not still be, as it were, plastic at the edges? Might we not still be developing and changing and genuinely evolving, if only on the margin?
Well, I think one has to be, again, very cautious here, because while it's true in a very vague sense to say, it's correct to say that the systems that we now have developed through evolution and through natural selection. It's important to recognize how little we are saying when we say that. For example, it is certainly not necessarily the case that every particular trait that we have is the result of specific selection. That is, that we were selected for having that. In fact, there are striking examples to the contrary, or at least apparent examples to the contrary. Say, take for example our capacity to deal with abstract properties of the number system. Now that's a distinctive human capacity, as distinctive as the capacity for language. Any normal human, in fact, down to pathological levels, can comprehend the properties of the number system and can move very far in understanding their deep properties. But it's extremely difficult to believe that this capacity was the result of specific selection. That is, it's hard to believe that people who were a little better at proving theorems of number theory had more children, let's say. That didn't happen. In fact, through most of human evolution, in fact, essentially all of human evolution, this capacity it would have been impossible to know that this capacity even existed. The contingencies that allowed it to be exercised never arose. Nevertheless, the trait is there, the capacity is there, the mental organ, if you like, has developed. Presumably it has developed as a concomitant of some other properties of the brain which may have been selected. For example, we can speculate, say, that that increase in brain size was a factor in differential reproduction, hence in evolution. And it may be that for physical law, because of physical laws that we presently don't know, that an increase in brain size under the specific conditions of human evolution simply leads necessarily to a system which has the capacity to deal with properties of the number system. Well, then that's a matter of physics ultimately. And then the mind that evolves, the brain that evolves, will have this capacity, but not because it was achieved through selection. Now, I think it's at least likely that something of the sort is true of human language. I mean, surely if it were dysfunctional, it wouldn't have been maintained. It's obviously functional. But it's a long leap to claim that the specific structures of language are themselves the result of specific selection, and it's a leap that I don't think is particularly plausible.
It's another dogma that language and communication are about the same thing. But if you think about it, it's extremely implausible. For one thing, almost any behavior you carry out communicates something. A gesture, a hairstyle, almost anything. So sure, language behavior also communicates something. First of all, beyond that, almost all language is not involved in communication. And we all know that. I mean, you can't go 1 minute without talking to yourself. I mean, it takes a tremendous effort of will not to be doing whatever you're doing when what's going on in your head. Well, that's plainly not communication. You're doing it yourself. That's about 99.9% of the use of language. Now, in fact, when you really think, it's never been investigated, but if you introspect about it, it could be investigated seriously, from kind of third-person point of view, but hasn't been. So you can only sort of think about it yourself. But I can only tell you my introspections. You can figure out yours. But my introspections are that when I am thinking in language, it's not really language. There's just like an occasional word will flit along, and I know what I want to say, and then I can express it somehow, sometimes, either internally or externally. But if it's the same for you, then that suggests that there's some kind of language use going on in there that isn't even using the articulated language system. And it's just kind of hovering in there somewhere. Occasionally bits and pieces come out, and if you try, you can say them to yourself or say them outside. And you know when you get it right, which means that you must have meant something, and the articulation that you produce can match what you meant. But what you meant is in some internal language. And furthermore, even if you look at the part of language, very small part, that's external, like what we're doing, a very small part of that is communication in a serious sense. I mean, a lot of it is just setting up social relations, telling jokes to your friends, passing time. I mean, it's not communication in a meaningful sense of the word communication. So I think it's just a big mistake to identify communication with language. Remember, language hasn't evolved at all for 50,000 years since humans left Africa. A small group left Africa, spread all over the world. And we're all basically identical. If you take an infant from an Amazonian tribe that hasn't had other human contact for 20,000 years and bring it up in Baltimore, it'll speak straight Baltimore English, end up here studying physics, and conversely. So there doesn't seem to be, there are individual differences among humans, but there don't seem any significant or almost detectable group differences. So nothing's happened for about 50,000 years. And if you go back about 50,000 years before that, there isn't really any evidence that there was language. I mean, in that, of course, we're beyond, as I said, you don't have comparative evidence, you don't have fossil evidence, but you do have artifacts. And in fact, there was a big kind of creative explosion that took place somewhere in that window, let's say maybe 75,000 years ago, a sudden explosion of symbolic representation, complex social structures, observations, apparent observations of astronomical events, all kinds of things just suddenly happened. In general, it's usually assumed, we don't have direct evidence, that this must have been connected with this sudden emergence of language. And notice that it's very sudden in evolutionary times. Now you can double or triple the numbers. It's still a flick of an eyelash in evolutionary time. So somewhere in a very small window, something happened, and then nothing happened afterwards. That part we're pretty sure of. Well, what would have happened? Whatever happened, unless there's some mechanism that biology hasn't discovered yet, whatever happened would be some rewiring of the brain, some mutation that caused a rewiring of the brain. And that rewiring of the brain would have given this mechanism, this computational mechanism that allows these things to happen. But a rewiring of the brain, a mutation takes place in an individual, not in a group. Okay, that's obvious. So this happened to somebody, you know, some person in some small hunter-gatherer group underwent this change. That person had the capacity to do what we all do internally, but without the externalization, because there was nobody to talk to. You know? So there's no reason to think it was externalized at all. It's just that whatever is going on in our heads that is pre-linguistic, that we get bits and pieces of it when we think about, that would have been available for one person. Well, you know, if there's any selective advantage to that, say ability to plan and so on, it could have been, it could proliferate in a small group there over generations. There could be enough people who had that, so it would make some sense to interact. But then at that point you would get externalization. But externalization is a very tough process. There's this internal thing in the head which developed without any external pressures, okay, because there were no selectional pressures on it, almost by definition. So it's kind of like a snowflake, you know, something that just develops because that's the way nature works. You have this thing in the head, you have a sensory motor system, which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years and has nothing to do with it, and you have to match them up. That's a complicated process. And in fact, that's where practically, as far as we know, that's where almost all the complexity of language is. When you learn a language, that's what you learn. A child who's acquiring a language, that's what they acquire. Nobody teaches you, you don't learn the kinds of things I mentioned at the beginning, which are probably just part of the way the snowflake works. So it was, and then of course, once you have the externalization, you could have some kind of communication.
What do you think religion is?
Depending what you mean by religion. I mean, if you mean the Abrahamic religions.
We're on weak ground here because, of course, I'm religiously illiterate. But
okay, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Well, no, I mean, I guess, yeah, and the other such religions of that type. What are those?
Well, Buddhism is different. Yeah. Spiritual beliefs among Native Americans was different.
No,
I mean, there's all kind of religions.
The distinction that we're talking about there.
We're talking about the Abrahamic religion.
No, Catholicism,
okay,
Protestantism.
Yeah, that's the
Hindu, I guess.
No, the Hindus are different. I mean, it's quite different. Buddhism is quite different. I mean, if you really look at these systems of belief, they differ a lot. In fact,
no, but what I'm asking is, what is religion per se? Not what are the beliefs of a particular religion?
Belief that there's something in the world which is beyond my grasp, which is determining the way things happen, and it's going to, you know, it'll be a consolation for me. Maybe, you know, if my child is dying, I'll see him again in heaven somewhere. I mean, these kinds of beliefs, and that there's a sort of a spiritual force somewhere beyond my grasp. And that explains why things are happening. And that's probably ubiquitous. That's perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, weird things are happening. Like the sun is going around the earth. You can see it. I mean, it doesn't have to be happening, but you see it. Well, something must be making it happen. Okay, so it's Apollo on his chariot pulling the sun. And the same with everything else that goes on. You don't understand anything that's happening in the world, in personal life. And, you know, why is my child, sweet little wonderful kid, dying? He didn't do anything. So there's got to be some explanation somewhere.
So it's a set of stories to make sense of reality, except not science.
I mean, Apollo pulling the sun with a chariot is, well, it's early science. It's a kind of a scientific theory, you know, it's been worked out, you know, not trivial. Like, you know, for example, the classical Greeks did discover a lot of things.
But if you say it now, when there's lots of evidence other than that, then it's no longer science.
That just means that our understanding has deepened.
Right.
But, you know, the transition from magic to science is a pretty smooth transition. And it just, I mean, even the word science in English didn't even appear until the mid-19th century. I mean, there was a word, but it meant something else, just meant knowledge. In the mid-19th century, there was a divorce between science and philosophy. Before, it was just philosophy. In fact, if you go to Oxford, let's say, you can study natural philosophy and moral philosophy. Natural philosophy is what we here call the natural sciences. Moral philosophy is what we call the humanities. But through German, you know, it's the same thing. So the whole concept of science, in our sense, is a pretty recent one. And it began, and there was an intellectual revolution. You know, it sort of begins with Galileo and, you know, goes on, and it led to enormous insights. And after a while, science just kind of took off and became a special domain. In the early 19th century, it was, take, say, Kant. He couldn't have told you whether he was a philosopher or a scientist. You know, he taught astronomy. I mean, he taught moral philosophy. And, yeah, an intelligent, educated gentleman did all those things. Well, by the mid-19th century, it's becoming very hard to do all those things. The sciences were reaching a point where you really understand things. And you couldn't be a gentleman who knows everything. So, okay, things got professionalized, and we get, you know, what we call science, separate domain. But recall how recent this is. Prior to that, people were trying to figure things out. And we might now call what they're trying to figure out magic, but these are pretty smart people. Take, say, Isaac Newton. He's not a fool exactly. I mean, he's now kind of, people laugh about the fact that he would spend most of his life working on chemistry and church fathers. That was alchemy and church fathers. That was perfectly reasonable. I mean, in terms of the what are called corpuscularian theories that everybody accepted. You know, the world is made up of little building blocks like bricks. And
shift a few.
Yeah, shift a few and you get gold from lead. That makes perfect sense. As for the church fathers, that made perfect sense too. I mean, he was coming right after the humanist period when there had been a sudden discovery of the wealth and richness of classical civilizations, which hadn't been known. So the belief expanded that these guys really understood something. And they were kind of keeping it secret for us, so they were doing it in an esoteric way. And if we can decode what they were doing, we'll get all kind of wonderful discoveries. So it wasn't an irrational pursuit.
Would you, or do you consider yourself a person of faith?
I try not to have faith. I believe in a principle that was enunciated rather well by Bertrand Russell, which is that you should try to keep away from having irrational beliefs. You should believe some things that for which you can find some evidence or some support, apart from commitment to principles like equality and freedom and justice and so on. Those, I wouldn't say that's faith. Those are things you're committed to. But as far as beliefs about the world, reality, my feeling is one should try to, as much as possible, have substantiated beliefs, or at least beliefs for which evidence could be appropriate.
Well then, would you consider yourself, paradoxically, a person who has faith in the scientific method?
I think it's the only method we have to try to get some approximate understanding of the world. I don't have faith that it'll reach the truth, or even that it's leading us in the true direction. In fact, as someone committed to the scientific method, I'm also committed to its consequences, and among them are that you and I and the rest of the species are organic creatures who have our specific capacities and limitations, and we simply don't know and have no reason to believe that these capacities are such that we can gain the
truth about the world. We do our best, but that's the most we can do.
But the people would say that you cannot have moral principles unless you adhere to a faith.
If I attribute those principles to a divine creature who I define as ordering me to have those principles, the principles don't become any more better established. So that's a useless step. It's true that our moral principles are not firmly grounded in unshakable evidence and argument, but nothing is going to make them any more firmly grounded. As for having a meaningful life, that seems to me irrelevant. No people who have meaningful lives with faith and without faith.
Do you think holding a supernatural worldview is healthy and beneficial for humanity?
It's not for me. I don't see any point to it at all. On the other hand, I know that it means religious beliefs and other forms of supernaturalism happen to mean a lot to a lot of people. If I find someone who's, say, mourning the loss of a dead child and is comforted by the idea that they'll be reunited with the child in heaven, it's not my business to try to convince them that their belief is incorrect. In fact, in a way, I think they're lucky to be able to have such a belief. I don't have it, and I don't think in the long run it's healthy. But we can't legislate to other people what they should believe in order to, say, comfort themselves.
What in general do you feel then about religion's role in human society, both historically and here in the 21st century?
Overall, I think it's, in terms of its effect on policy, ranging from social policy to war, I think it's been mostly negative. In fact, often extremely negative. With regard to individuals, it varies. For a lot of people, it just means a lot and always has.
What do you think, behaviorally speaking, humans primarily are? That is, do you think we have a sort of Hobbesian human nature or a plastic human nature or something else? Because this seems to, when you hear either conservatives or liberals or people on the far right or far left discuss what kind of policies and what kind of economics and what we should have, how we should deal with the rest of the world, it usually often comes back, at least to justify their opinions, it always comes back to, well, this is what humans are, and this is therefore more natural for us to do A, have a capitalist society, or B, have a socialist society. What do you think is the basic human nature or do you think that we have a basic human nature?
I believe that we are part of the natural world, okay? Mm-hmm. Therefore, we have a nature. It's our genetic endowment determines substantially what our nature is. In fact, if you look at the growth of any organism, us, bees, yeast, whatever you like, there are actually three factors that enter into its growth and development. One is its genetic constitution, another is environmental effects, and a third is just the way laws of nature work, which turns out as a major effect. And the inquiry into biological organisms takes all of those into account, or should. As for our the human nature, the genetic endowment that we essentially share, very little is known about it. I mean, it's just a really hard question. And as I mentioned in our earlier discussion, a lot of the ways of studying it are excluded simply because we don't allow invasive experimentation. Mm. It's hard enough to learn about insect nature, right, where we allow ourselves anything. And they're much simpler organisms. So what do we know about human nature? Well, most of our knowledge comes from history, experience, literary exploration, and so on. That's what our knowledge comes from. What does it tell us? It tells us that, of course, humans are partially plastic. Like, I don't speak Swahili, for example, so we're partially plastic. On the other hand, there has to be an enormous uniformity at a level right below the surface. And what we see on the surface is a wide range of possibilities. I mean, we see people who are acting in a beastly fashion. We see others who are kind of sacrificing their lives to save dolphins.
One of the sciences, and I'm not sure if it would be categorized the hard science or soft science, or it's an emerging science, evolutionary psychology. People like E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker have come around and said they understand what human nature is, and it's based on this new science. Are you saying then that they're either still just guessing, or do they have some scientific backing that, from what you have, if you have read any of their work?
Yes, I know their work, and I know a lot of them. What's now called evolutionary psychology was in fact initiated about a century ago, by Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist thinker and naturalist, who wrote a book called Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. And in it, he investigated, he was basically trying to counter social Darwinists. He was Darwinist himself, and he argued by looking at a lot of naturalistic phenomena, other animals, human history, and so on. He argued that if you look at it, you discover that mutual aid had provided a selectional advantage, and therefore organisms had evolved through selection, including humans, to be deeply committed to one or another form of mutual aid. Well, that's not what elite opinion wants to hear. They want to hear some other story. So therefore, Kropotkin's form of evolutionary psychology essentially disappeared. It's been revived to some extent. The actual modern state of evolutionary psychology, it's not that there's no science there at all. There's some, like say kin selection is real, reciprocal altruism is real, a couple other things are real, but very little is known. It's thin. This is not physics, and it's not molecular biology, it's not chemistry. It's largely guesses. It's a worthwhile topic to pursue. I think it's a fine topic to pursue. In fact, that's where my own professional work is in particular areas. But scientists particularly should be very cautious about inducing and deluding the public to think that they know more than they do. Science is held in enormous respect for good reasons, and therefore scientists have a responsibility to make very clear, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And what we know in these areas happens to be extremely thin, not because they're not good scientists, but because the questions are too hard.
There was a concept of materialism right through the early scientific revolution, right through Newton. Newton still accepted it. In fact, the great scientists of the next century accepted it. Lagrange, others kept trying to develop a material, mechanistic concept of the universe that went right through the 19th century, ether theories and so on. It was finally given up in the 20th century. Finally recognized, look, we're never going to get it. And totally different ways of looking at things were developed, which have no relation to traditional materialism. Friedrich Lang is correct. And nobody's ever suggested another notion. Materialism just is like anything we more or less understand. It includes thinking, it includes reasoning, and so on and so forth. Locke's suggestion. So we can't leave it behind unless someone tells it what it is. But there's no reason why we can't study it. We can study what the human capacity of understanding is. In fact, we know some things about it. We know some negative things. For example, we can't understand the way the world works because our concept of understanding is too limited to incorporate what Newton described as an absurdity. People like Newton and Hume and Locke were not idiots. We have to take them seriously. They regarded it as an absurdity for very good reasons. And modern cognitive science, which somehow tries to recapitulate some of this, finds pretty much that. So, as I mentioned, an infant presented with presentations which indicate that there's some kind of causality, like, when the ball rolls this way, light turns red or something. They will invent a mechanical cause. And they don't care if it's not visible, because infants understand that most of what goes on is invisible. But there's got to be some mechanical cause, otherwise no way for it to influence anything else. So that does seem to be the way our minds work. And that tells us something about the limits of our understanding. In fact, a classical, crucial case. And it can go on to other cases. And we can study it directly. In principle, we can study it directly. It's not simple. It's not easy to understand why a rat can't deal with a prime number maze. Even that's hard. We have good evidence that it's true, but why it's true is unclear. There's nothing known about the brains of rats that explains why they can't do that. In fact, we can't explain why, say, the tiniest organism that's seriously studied, C. elegans, nematodes, 800 cells, 300 neurons, entire wiring diagram known. There have been years of study trying to explain why this thing, it goes left instead of right, let's say. It's just, we don't know how to explain that. There's an answer, but these are hard scientific questions. When you talk about how human intelligence works, it's incomparably more difficult. So you can ask the questions, you can cut away at them, but we shouldn't exaggerate. It's kind of striking that, going back to what philosophy ought to do, philosophers often appear to intend to want to get answers about humans that we can't get about insects. And that's too much, Science sort of works at the edges of understanding, and it faces hard questions all the way. So we can sort of talk about it, but if you want to seriously work on it, you have to take a look at what is understood and try to see if you can formulate questions which can be investigated and will tell us more about what's understood. Actually, there's interesting work going on this, having to do with things like the human moral instinct. In the past 20, 30 years, that's become an experimental subject with interesting experimental work on probably universal moral principles. A very important book just came out a couple of weeks ago by John Mikhail. He's a philosopher who now teaches law at Georgetown University, who gives a very acute, he more or less initiated this modern study. He didn't publish much, but other people have drawn off his work. Combination of reanalysis of traditional moral philosophy, mainly Rawls and his antecedents, and an analysis of a lot of the critique of Rawls, and then on to developing experimental programs to investigate some of these questions. And it's feasible. Maybe we can get some insight into innate human moral concepts that are cross-cultural, like you're going to find them in every culture, and that you can find with young children, pre any serious cultural impact. Those are all things that can be studied, and there's beginnings of studies.
Centrally, your whole approach represents a rejection of the empirical tradition in philosophy, doesn't it? Because, I mean, the very fact that you think that the empiricists are wrong about how we learn must mean that they're wrong about knowledge and the nature of knowledge. And the nature of knowledge has been the central problem in the whole empirical tradition of philosophy.
Well, the classical empiricist tradition, which I think was the tradition that's represented, let's say, perhaps in its highest form by Hume, seems to me to be a tradition of extreme importance in that a particular theory of the origins of knowledge, in fact, of the science of human nature, in Hume's phrase, was put forth. An empirical theory, and I think Hume, for example, would have regarded it as an empirical theory, did regard it. So when we investigate it, I think we discover that it's just completely false. That is, that the mechanisms that he discussed are not the mechanisms by which the mind reaches states of knowledge, that the states of knowledge attained are radically different than the kinds that he discussed. For example, for Hume, the mind was, in his image, a kind of a theater in which ideas paraded across the stage, and it therefore followed necessarily that we could introspect completely into the contents of our mind. If an idea is not on the stage, it's not in the mind. And the ideas may be connected and associated. In fact, he went on to say there isn't even any theater. There's just the ideas. In that respect, the image is misleading. Well, that's a theory. And in fact, it's a theory that has had an enormous grip on the imagination throughout most of the to my knowledge, most of the history of Western thought. For example, that same image dominates the rationalist tradition as well, where it was assumed that one could exhaust the contents of the mind by careful attention. You could really develop those clear and distinct ideas and their consequences and so on. And in fact, even if you move to someone, let's say, like Freud, with his evocation of the unconscious, still I think that a careful reading suggests that he regarded the unconscious as in principle accessible. That is, we could really perceive that theater and stage and the things on it carefully if only the barriers of repression and so on could be overcome. Well, if what I've been suggesting is correct, that's radically wrong. I mean, even wrong as a point of departure. There is no reason at all that I can see for believing that the principles of mental computation that enter so intimately into our action or our interaction or our speech, to believe that those principles are at all accessible to introspection, any more than the analyzing mechanisms of our visual system, or for that matter, the nature of our liver, is accessible to introspection.
It seems to me that over and over again you come back to the same point. That is to say that many of the particular problems discussed and theories put forward by philosophers in the main, but also psychologists, and you've just mentioned Freud, and in your writings you mentioned many others, are in fact theories about physical processes. They are therefore open to checking by investigation, and when you check by investigation you find out that the theories are wrong, and therefore you are, as it were, radically subversive of a lot of very well established theories in our tradition. It seems to me that what you put forward in their place over and over again in fact does parallel the rationalist tradition. I said in my introduction to this program that what I'm always reminded of by your work is the theories of Kant. You seem to me to be almost redoing, in terms of modern linguistics, what Kant was doing. Do you accept any?
Well, I not only accept truth in it, but I've tried to bring it out in a certain way. However, I haven't myself specifically referred to Kant, but rather to primarily to the 17th century tradition of the continental Cartesians and the British Neoplatonists, who developed many of the ideas that are now much more familiar in the writings of Kant. For example, the idea of experience conforming to our mode of cognition, or well, particularly in the British Platonists, Cudworth, for example, I believe, is a rich mine of insight into the organizing principles of the mind by which experience is structured. In fact, I think that's some of the richest source of psychological insights that I know. And that's the one, it's this tradition that I think that can be fleshed out and made more explicit by the kinds of empirical inquiry that are now possible. Of course, I think we also have to diverge from that tradition in a number of respects. I've mentioned one, namely the belief that the contents of the mind are open to introspection. Similarly, there's certainly no reason to accept the metaphysics of that tradition, to believe that there's a dualism of mind and body. I mean, you can see why the Cartesians were led to that. It was a rational move on their part, but it's not a move that we have to follow. We have other ways of approaching that question.
So, say, take a look at some other organism. Look, say I mentioned a rat. You can teach a rat to run complicated mazes. You know, turn right and then turn left and turn right and left, and a lot of things it can do. You cannot teach a rat to run a prime number maze, a maze in which you're supposed to turn right at every prime number. You can teach a human that. You know, they have to figure out the prime numbers in their heads, but then they can do it. A rat can't do it with an infinite amount of training. It simply does not have that concept. So it's a total mystery for rats. That's kind of analogous to the fact that a human embryo can't grow wings. It's just beyond its capacity. Now, there are some, I think the scientifically and philosophically interesting question is, what things are beyond human scope? What things are mysteries to us in the same way that a prime number maze is a mystery to rats? And I think there's a very interesting record of things in the world. The most simple and striking and dramatic one is interaction of objects. You go back to the medieval period and the neo-scholastic period. It was assumed that there are what were called sympathies and antipathies. So sympathies brought two objects together and antipathies pushed them apart. When you get to Galileo and modern science begins, these notions were ridiculed. What's a sympathy and antipathy? It's called an occult idea. And Galileo introduced a conception that guided modern science. It's the one I quoted. The world is a machine. everything that happens can be duplicated by a skilled artisan. In fact, it was created by a skilled artisan, you know. But and that's what was called the mechanical philosophy. Everything works like a machine, and the modern science developed on the principle that unless you can show that something works like a machine, you haven't explained it. So Galileo, at the end of his life, was kind of in despair because he had not shown that the movement of the tides, let's say, or the heavenly bodies could be accounted for by mechanical principles. Descartes, a little bit later, thought that he had shown that you could do it. Leibniz had his own version. Christian Huygens had another version. But that was modern science until Newton. Newton demonstrated there are no machines. Nothing works by mechanical principles. He just concluded that that is an absurdity, that no person with any scientific understanding could possibly accept. And he was right, but it's true. And scientists just had to kind of accept the fact that the world is not intelligible to us. That's a major mystery, and science changed totally at that point. It happened slowly, you know, so it kind of became assimilated into common sense, but scientists no longer try to find a picture of the world that's intelligible to our intuitions. What they try to do is construct theories that are intelligible, but that's a totally different topic, much lower goal, and that's post-Newtonian science. Well, that's one huge mystery, but I think there are plenty of others. Like, take, say, freedom of will. There's big debates about freedom of will. It's kind of striking that everyone who participates in these debates, including the people who write learned tomes showing there's no freedom of will, believe in freedom of will. Otherwise, they wouldn't write the learned tomes. I mean, if we're all just thermostats of some complicated kind, then what you do is determined and how people react is determined, so what's the point of the effort? You know, none. So everyone kind of intuitively believes it. I mean, we all believe that I can either pick this up or throw it across the room or not do anything with it. But what is it? Well, it lies beyond. I think you can speculate about what the core of the problem is. If you take a look at human science, there are two concepts that are pretty well understood. One of them is determinacy. Something determines something else, you know. The other one is randomness. Things happen without anything determining them. And that's about it, I think. Those are the basic concepts that we comprehend. And freedom of will just doesn't fit in that set of concepts. Well, it could be that this is just another mystery for humans. We don't have the right concept. Some Martian might be looking at us and thinking how stupid we are. Why do we keep the determinacy and randomness when there's obviously that thing out there that I can't point to because I'm a human? You know? Could be. And many other things that seem imponderable might turn out to be like this. I mean, once we recognize that we're not angels, we are just biological organisms, and as such we must have limits. That's just point of logic. You could not have any capacities at all if you didn't have limits, because the capacities determine the limits. And then a question comes, well, what's beyond the limits? And we have some examples, plausible examples. There may be many others. And I think that's a fertile direction to explore once we abandon the kind of belief that we can do anything, which is a very common belief. And in the modern sciences, it's very common. That's just not true.
Do you believe that the mind is, in principle, computable, implying that it could be emulated on other substrates in the future? On other substrates, like silicon, I think he's talking about.
The mind is organized matter. It's organized in a particular way which we don't understand, but we don't understand much about bee communication. There's no reason, we don't know of any physical reason to believe that the particular components of that organized matter are critical for its operation. It appears to be something about the way it's organized. That's as far as we know, so therefore it could be emulated, presumably, in some other substances.
Yeah, I mean, as a physicist, I mean, we are a computing machine of some sort, and it happens to be we happen to use a certain system for storing and reproducing, whether it's genetic or electrical. It's hard to imagine that any other system that if we were able to reproduce all that information, we wouldn't get the same person.
But it's one of those cases, as you said before, where you really have to be humble because so little is understood about it. And the major question, what is the puppeteer doing?
Yeah.
That one we don't even know how to address.
This emerging notion that many of our conscious decisions are really not conscious. Maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Well, there's there's some experimental evidence by now that when you undertake a voluntary action, like say picking this up, very briefly before you are conscious of making the decision, the parts of your brain that are organizing the action are already active, which means that the decision is made pre-consciously and then reaches consciousness at some point. Most of our decisions never reach consciousness. We're doing all kinds of things all the time and totally unaware of them. And parts of the way we have two brains, remember. There's this one and there's this one, sometimes called the gut brain, the enteric nervous system, which is a real nervous system. It's rich in neurons, it suffers Alzheimer's. It's very similar to this one. And we haven't the slightest consciousness about what it's doing. Unless you get a stomach ache, then you know it's not working properly. But with regard to language, unfortunately, there has been no serious investigation of the question, though it could be investigated. So we're left at the moment with introspection. That's not a good state, but try it. When you introspect about your thinking and language, I think what you find is that the expressions you articulate to yourself, come almost instantaneously, indicating that there was pre-conscious organization of the thought that is sometimes reaching consciousness and often is not. And I suspect that when these topics begin to be investigated, which is not impossible, that's what we're going to discover, that this mystery of what the puppeteer is doing is probably pre-conscious. We will not get access to it through conscious introspection, but only in indirect ways, the way we learn what the enteric nervous system is doing. That's a guess about what will be discovered if these topics are ever investigated seriously. One of the reasons they're not investigated is because of the assumption in modern philosophy psychology that consciousness is the hard problem. I don't think that's true. I suspect consciousness is a problem that we know how to address. You can find the mechanisms involved in consciousness. You'll learn a lot about it. Pre-conscious decisioning choices, I suspect, is a much deeper problem.
Okay, well, this is interesting. I mean, we're asked to speculate on things about the future, for which we really, as we should emphasize, about a system that we don't understand much of now. But in that spirit, and following up on this idea that maybe that the brain is a material entity and therefore might be reproduced elsewhere, Bishop has asked, do you think that AI, and this is a really interesting question, I think, do you think that AI will have the same snowflake language apparatus or quick evolutionary moments in regards to creativity and language? Namely, assuming AI becomes conscious, would you imagine it would have the same kind of language development? It's a really speculative question, but it's an interesting one, it seems to me.
Well, first of all, I should be a little cautious about AI. What exactly is it? There's two variants of AI. One is roughly, science and engineering. I mean, it's a rough distinction. There's the kind of AI which is trying to construct devices that are useful, self-driving cars, robots that can clean your house, things like that. That's fine. It's not really contributing, except very indirectly, to the understanding of how cognitive systems, intelligent systems work. It's doing things that are useful, which is fine. It's like building a bigger bulldozer. It's great. There's another kind of AI, which is pure science, which is trying to discover the nature of what is going on when a nematode decides to turn to the left, or when I decide to pick this up. But that's the same as, it might be called AI if you like, but it's the same as just science, cognitive science. What will happen if I think the question is asking, what if robots are designed which have the same properties, the mechanisms that we will come to understand are essential for consciousness? Will they be conscious? We can already ask that question about dogs. I mean, are they conscious? In fact, you can ask that question about me. You know you're conscious. Do you know that I'm conscious? No, just because I tell you I am. That doesn't mean anything. The robot could too.
There's the Turing test, which it turns out to be not a very good test after all.
Well, the Turing test is kind of interesting. Turing himself was a very brilliant mathematician and scientist. He understood that the test didn't amount to much. The history of the Turing test is kind of intriguing. This is based on an 8-page paper around 1950 called Can Machines Think or something. Turing in that paper says the question whether machines can think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. And he's right. Asking whether machines can think is like asking whether submarines swim. If you want to call that swimming, it's swimming. And in fact, like the airplanes fly. In English, they fly. In Hebrew, they glide. Do people fly? In Japanese, when they're jumping, they fly. In English, they don't. These are terminological questions. What we can do, and Turing, he did suggest this imitation game, but it is not, as he pointed out, an answer to the question whether machines think, because it's not a serious question. The notion thinking isn't well enough defined, so you can ask whether it's being achieved by some device. Now, it's kind of striking that if you go back to the 17th century, the same questions were asked, but as scientific questions. So go back to Descartes, who observed, as far as we know correctly, that this creative aspect of language use is a unique human capacity. Well, that immediately led to experimental proposals. Descartes de Moi, the minor Cartesians, outlined tests that you could use, a series of experiments that you could use if there was another creature who looked like you and you wanted to find out if he had this capacity. And he pointed out, like a scientist, that if the creature passes all the tests you can think of, then it would be reasonable to assume that he has the capacity. It doesn't prove it, but you don't prove things in science. That was a serious version of the Turing test. It was about something real, alleged, namely a capacity that you're trying to test for. It's kind of like a litmus test, for acidity. There's something real, you're trying to find out whether some object has it. That's very different from the Turing test. In fact, in many ways, I think there's been kind of intellectual regression from the 17th century to today, replacing the serious tests about reality, litmus tests for a particular capacity, by a test that's basically like answering the question whether submarines swim.
Doesn't mean much more than that.
Let's follow up on that a little, because you know, you talked earlier this evening about the idea that maybe things, the whatever it was that initiated the possibility of language, had to be, in a sense, because of the laws of nature. The thing that would be interesting to me is whether, therefore, there is a unique set of cognitive processes. And so it would be interesting if one had machines that think to see if they think differently. I think that would be a fascinating question.
Certainly. We know that there are some that are different. So, for example, an automated procedure for, say, determining whether a paper in the American Mathematical Society gives a real proof. If you look at things that are called proofs, I mean, there are lots of intuition and, you know, appeal to what people know and so on.
Yeah.
You try to formalize it and fill them in the details, it's pretty hard, but sometimes turn out to be very hard. But you can think of automated ways of doing that, which are not the ways we do it.
And as I've said in the stage before, we know that computers think, at least right now, think differently, because they use energy in a very vastly different way.
They do all kinds of things that we can't do. But
and they also do it much, in some sense, much more inefficiently in terms of energy consumption.
Yeah, but so do cars.
Yeah, yeah.